Sigmund Freud, the influential Austrian neurologist, was born Sigismund Shlomo Freud on May 6, 1856, to Jewish parents in the Moravian town of Freiburg. Following his graduation as a doctor of medicine from the University of Vienna in 1881, Freud set up his clinical practice in Vienna, where he remained until the Nazi annexation of Austria in 1938. After fleeing Nazi persecution, Freud passed away in exile in the United Kingdom in 1939. Freud is best known as the founder of psychoanalysis, a distinctive clinical method of diagnosing and treating psychological issues. His therapeutic techniques, including free association and identification of transference, completely revolutionized the field of psychology. Freud's theories of the mind and human agency were groundbreaking, particularly his theory of the unconscious, which paved the way for the conceptualization of the ID, ego, and super-ego structure of the psyche. His insights into sexuality and the formulation of the Oedipus complex are pivotal in psychoanalytical theory. Additionally, Freud recognized the existence of the libido and the death drive. He suggested that these forces influence our mental processes, contribute to the formation of attachments, and are the source of compulsive repetition, aggression, neurotic guilt, and even hatred. His later works included broad interpretations and critiques of religion and culture. Despite ongoing debates about the effectiveness of psychoanalysis as a clinical practice and its relevance in modern psychology, Freud's contributions have profoundly influenced Western thought and popular culture. As noted by poet W. H. Auden in his 1940 tribute to Freud, the Austrian neurologist effectively created a new framework under which we understand and conduct our lives. The tale squarely situates itself in Freud's early years, beginning with a note of separation from a cherished childhood companion, John Jacob Freud, when his half-brothers moved to England. This, however, is just the commencement of several displacements. Freud's family also relocated first to Leipzig in 1857, then to Vienna in 1860, adding 5 more siblings to his family. Freud's natural intellect surfaced early as a high-achieving student, fluent in a multitude of languages, shepherding him into the University of Vienna at 17, where his initial intention to study law pivoted towards medicine. His studies involved laps under the tutelage of esteemed intellectuals, such as Franz Brentano, Ernst Brücke, and Karl Claus. From dissecting eels to compare brains between species, Freud's substantial studies, despite an interruption for mandatory military service, paved the way for the discovery of neurons in the 1890s. After completing his military service, Freud finished med in 1881 and began at the Vienna General Hospital. His clinical work and research resulted in authoritative papers on cerebral anatomy and aphasia, earned him a lecturing position at the University of Vienna. In 1886, he resigned from the hospital to start a private practice focusing on nervous disorders. He married Martha Bernays that year, and the intricacies of their multicultural wedding reflect Freud's internal struggle with religion. Numerous religious ceremonies were performed despite Freud's personal atheism. The couple had 6 children. Their residence from 1891 until 1938 at Bergasse 19, Vienna, stands as a significant historical site and concludes this narrative of Freud's life. Brentano's work in psychology from an empirical standpoint, in which he contemplated the concept of the unconscious mind despite ultimately rejecting it, likely served as a valuable precursor for Freud's own exploration of this topic. Additionally, Freud was influenced by Charles Darwin's seminal evolutionary texts, Eduard von Hartmann's The Philosophy of the Unconscious, Fechner Erbart's Underrated Psychology as Science, and Theodor Lipps, who was a prominent theorist of unconscious and empathy in those days. Despite some discernible parallels between Freud's theories and the philosophies of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, Freud was generally cautious about attributing his psychoanalytical findings to earlier philosophical works. Although Freud admitted to occasional reads of Nietzsche and having an emotional connection with his writings, he avoided studying Nietzsche extensively because of the excessive wealth of ideas in his texts and their close resemblance with his own emerging thoughts at that point. There is evidence that Freud read Nietzsche's The Birth of Tragedy and possibly the first 2 of the untimely meditations in his late teens, as affirmed by historian Peter L. Wronitzky, citing Freud's correspondence with his old friend Eduard Silberstein after procuring Nietzsche's complete works in 1900. Freud expressed a hope to find in Nietzsche's works the words for much that remains mute in me. Freud's interest in Nietzsche's writings notwithstanding, he preferred to resist more than study them, whilst his focus on philosophy in general waned after he veered towards the profession of neurology. Throughout his life, Freud, proficient in English, held a special place for William Shakespeare. It's speculated that his deep understanding of human psychology was likely influenced in part by Shakespeare's plays. Freud's Jewish heritage had a significant impact on his intellectual and moral perspectives and his nonconformist stance. His Jewish roots were also reflected in his psychoanalytical ideas, specifically when it came to a shared focus on deep interpretation and the bounding of desire by law. Freud first endeavored to build a comprehensive theory of the mind named the Project for a Scientific Psychology. During this process, he collaborated closely with Fless, attempting to connect neurology and psychology. However, these efforts were thwarted due to certain obstacles. Some profound aspects of the project made its reappearance in the interpretation of dreams. Freud suffered from nasal reflex neurosis and sought treatment from Fless, which involved repeated surgeries on his nose and sinuses. He also referred a patient, Emma Eckstein, who was experiencing severe leg, stomach, and menstrual pains. Symptoms Freud attributed to habitual self-stimulation. As per Fless's theories, the nasal and genital tissues were thought to have a relation. Thus, surgery on the middle turbinate was considered as the cure. Unfortunately, the surgery was botched with Fless, leaving a large strip of gauze in Eckstein's nasal cavity, resulting in excessive bleeding and permanent disfiguration. In the midst of the tragedy, Freud, while acknowledging Fless's responsibility, didn't confront him directly about his disastrous role. He maintained a discreet silence or diverted the conversation to Eckstein's hysteria. After reviewing Eckstein's history of self-mutilation and irregular bleeding, Freud concluded that Fless was innocent as Eckstein's post-operative hemorrhages were psychosomatic, related to her desire to be loved. When sick, Eckstein continued her sessions with Freud, who eventually managed to restore her full mobility, after which she took up psychoanalysis as a career. Despite Freud's initial admiration for Fless, referring to him as the Kepler of biology, he later attributed his loyalty and overestimation of Fless's work to his homoerotic feelings and his commitment to his deep-rooted Jewish mysticism. Their friendship ended bitterly, with Fless accusing Freud of betraying him. By not acknowledging his theories and plagiarizing his work, their final estrangement happened after Freud extended an olive branch to collaborate on his 3 essays on the theory of sexuality and was met with silence. Earlier in October 1885, Freud studied in Paris on a fellowship with an eminent neurologist, Jean-Martin Charcot, who conducted research in hypnosis. Freud credits this experience as instrumental in steering him towards medical psychopathology, as it offered richer financial prospects than neurology research. Charcot, an expert in hysteria and hypnosis, studied these subjects thoroughly, often showcasing hypnotized patients on stage to medical others. The fluctuating outcomes of Freud's preliminary clinical work eventually led him to renounce hypnosis. He instead promoted a method where patients would openly discuss their thoughts and memories without restraint. This method, known as free association, proved to be a more reliable and effective way to alleviate symptoms. Freud also discovered that analyzing patients' dreams could unearth the intricate architecture of subconscious materials and the psychic practice of repression, which he believed was at the core of symptom formation. By 1896, he had begun referring to his new clinical approach and its foundations as psychoanalysis. During this time of theorization, Freud was battling with heart irregularities, unsettling dreams, phases of depression, and neurasthenia. He associated these struggles with his father's demise in 1896, which triggered Freud's self-analysis of his own dreams and childhood memories. His exploration of his resentment towards his father and jealous rivalry over his mother's attention resulted in a seismic shift in his understanding of the origins of neuroses. Freud's early clinical work led him to posit that subconscious memories of sexual abuse in early childhood were an essential precursor to psychoneuroses, such as hysteria and obsessional neurosis. This became known as Freud's seduction theory. However, as a result of his self-analysis, Freud dismissed the theory that all neuroses could be traced back to early childhood sexual abuse. He now proposed that these sexually tinted childhood scenarios, whether real or imagined, were disease, causing only when they manifested as suppressed memories. This redirection laid the groundwork for Freud's subsequent creation of the Oedipus complex theory. Freud published works detailing the evolution of his clinical method and his theory of the psychogenetic origins of hysteria, including several case histories and studies on hysteria, 1895, and the interpretation of dreams, 1899. The latter provided informed interpretations of his and his patients' dreams in the light of repression and censorship imposed by the dream. Freud then proposed a theoretical model of the psyche divided into unconscious, preconscious, and conscious. An abbreviated version on dreams was published in 1901. Freud later applied his theories beyond the clinical realm in the psychopathology of everyday life. 1901, and jokes in their relation to the unconscious. 1905, works that brought him broader recognition. Freud's early recognition of transference as a hindrance to the recovery of repressed memories transitioned by 1912 into an appreciation of its significant role in therapy. In 1902, Freud's long-standing ambition to attain the title of Professor Extraordinarius was finally achieved. Though devoid of either a salary or teaching duties, this title was key to Freud for the prestige and acknowledgement it offered. He will be promoted to Professor Ordinarius in 1920. Thanks to the intervention of an influential ex-patient, Baroness Marie Ferstel, and despite the university's backing, his professorship had been repeatedly obstructed by the authorities and was only after Ferstel supposedly presented the education minister with a valuable painting. With his enhanced prestige, Freud continued his tradition of Saturday evening lectures, which he had been conducting since the mid-1880s as a docent of Vienna University, held at the university's psychiatric clinic's lecture hall. As of 1902 autumn, Freud began to meet up weekly on Wednesday afternoons in his home with Viennese physicians interested in his work. These discussions decussated psychology and neuropathology. The assembly, known as the Wednesday Psychological Society, symbolized the dawn of the worldwide psychoanalytic crusade. This group was founded on Wilhelm Stiegl's recommendation, a physician and former student of Richard von Kraft, Ebing at the University of Vienna. Stiegl's foray into psychoanalysis is credited either to his successful treatment of a sexual issue by Freud or his affinity for the interpretation of dreams, which he favorably reviewed in the Neues Wiener Tagblatt daily newspaper. Alfred Adler, Max Kahane, and Rudolf Riedler were the other original members. All were physicians, childhood companions of Freud and Jewish by birth. Kahane and Riedler, who were also Freud's university mates, had been following Freud's ideas through his Saturday evening lectures. Kahane, who introduced Stiegl to Freud's work, set up an outpatient psychotherapy institute in 1901 in Vienna's Boermarkt. He published a medical textbook in the same year, providing an overview of Freud's psychoanalytic method. He broke with Freud for unknown reasons and left the Wednesday Psychological Society in 1907. Kahane tragically committed suicide in 1923. At the core of these meetings laid a distinct, solemn ritual: the presentation of a scholarly paper, followed by casual exchanges over strong black coffee, cakes, and excessive smoking. A period of sociable interactions ensued, which would naturally bloom into insightful discussions. The final judgment, however, always belonged to Freud, whose ambience evoked the inception of a religious order, making conventional psychological studies seem trivial. With Freud depicting the role of the new prophet, the group had expanded by 1906 with the addition of 16 members, including Otto Rank, who was appointed as the group's remunerated secretary. The conversation started to expand beyond the group, with Freud initiating a correspondence with a budding academic researcher, Carl Gustav Jung, who had already gained recognition for his work in word association and the galvanic skin response. Jung and colleague Ludwig Binswanger marked a significant moment in 1907, making a journey to meet Freud in Vienna and partake in the discussion group that later led to the formation of a psychoanalytic group in their home city of Zurich. As the group's reputation grew, it took the formal identity of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society with Freud as president, a position he later ceded to Adler in an attempt to pacify his growing criticisms. The society welcomed its first female member, Margaret Hilferding, in 1910, soon joined by fellow Russian psychiatrists Tatiana Rosenthal and Sabina Spielrein. Notably, Spielrein, prior to her successful academic studies, was former patient of Jung. The group's early supporters convened formally in April 1908, an assembly retrospectively considered as the first International Psychoanalytic Congress. The event took place upon the behest of Ernest Jones, a London-based neurologist inspired by Freud's ideologies and taking them into his practice, a prior acquaintance of Jung. Jones collaborated to organize this historic Congress. Among the dignitaries present at the Congress were Karl Abraham, Max Eidingen, Sandor Ferenczi, and Abraham Brill. This congregation set the tone for future relevance of psychoanalysis in the sphere of psychological studies. Freud leaned on the talents of Brill and Jones to promote psychoanalysis within English-speaking territories. Post the Salzburg Congress, he enlisted Brill to translate his works and appointed Jones with the responsibility of advancing Freudian concepts within North American academia and the medical field, in preparation for his impending role at the University of Toronto. This cultivation of Freudian perspectives paved the way for Freud's use. Tour, in the company of Jung and Ferenczi in September 1909, on the invitation of Stanley Hall, Clark University's incumbent president. This occasion saw Freud delivering a series of lectures on psychoanalysis and earning an honorary doctorate, leading to the first widely recognized acknowledgement of Freud's contributions and a surge in media recognition. Among those in attendance was James Jackson Putnam, a renowned psychiatrist and neurologist at Harvard, who subsequently invited Freud for an extended dialogue at his country residence. Putnam's ensuing endorsement marked a significant victory for the Freudian movement in America. The American Psychoanalytic Association, co-founded by Putnam and Jones in May 1911, saw them serve as president and secretary respectively. The same year, Brill established the New York Psychoanalytic Society and publicized English renditions of Freud's works. However, this unity amongst Freud's disciples commenced a descent into disarray from 1909. Adler began to deviate from Freud's theories, leading to significant ideological clashes at Viennese Psychoanalytic Society meetings in 1911. Soon after, Adler resigned from his presidential role in the society, with Steckel also stepping down from his vice presidential position. By June 1911, Adler and 9 others detached from the Freudian group and established their own association, which was soon dubbed the Society for Individual Psychology Post-World War I. Adler's growing link with a psychological viewpoint he coined as individual psychology became more apparent. Jung's alignment with Freud's principles became untenable, leading him to resign from his positions at Jahrbuch and the IPA in April 1914. Subsequently, the Zurich Society removed itself from the IPA. Freud later wrote an essay called The History of the Psychoanalytic Movement, discussing the evolution of the psychoanalytic movement and the subsequent departures of both Adler and Jung. The Oedipus complex, once the core of the psychoanalytic theory, was effectively abandoned in 1924 following Rank's publication, The Trauma of Birth. This move provoked critical commentary from both Abraham and Jones. Eventually, in 1926, Rank ended his extensive association with Freud. Exiting his positions at the IPA and moving from Vienna to Paris, Rank's position was filled by Anna Freud, and his evolved Freudian theory later influenced a new generation of therapists in the US. The founding of the IPA in 1910 marked the beginning of a global network of psychoanalytical institutes and clinics. Regular biannual congresses were initiated for coordination and sharing of clinical and theoretical expertise. Abraham and Eidingen founded the Berlin Psychoanalytic Society and the Berlin Psychoanalytic Institute in 1910, which extensively impacted the broader psychoanalytic movement through their novel treatment options and training standards. In 1927, Freud collaborated with Ernst Simmel to establish the Schloss Tegel Sanatorium, the first institution to provide psychoanalytic treatment. However, financial constraints led to its closure in 1931. Simultaneously, the Russian Psychoanalytic Society made significant strides with state-backed translations of Freud's work. Ernest Jones, one of the co-founders of the American Psychoanalytic Association in 1911, returned from Canada and founded the London Psychoanalytic Society in 1913. He later established the British Psychoanalytical Society in 1919. After dissolving the former society, this new society, purged of Jungian influence, saw Jones serving as its president until 1944. The unfolding story emphasizes the prominence and expansion of psychoanalytic societies and institutes across the world, spearheaded by Freud's followers, such as Eidingen. These institutes were established in several countries, including Switzerland, 1919, France, 1926, Italy, 1932, the Netherlands, 1933, Norway, 1933, Palestine, Jerusalem, 1933, Palestine, Jerusalem, 1933, and America, New York, 1931, the last Freudian Congress held in Berlin due to his deteriorating health caused by a cancerous jaw. Despite his failing health, Freud remained instrumental in steering the development of psychoanalysis through strategic correspondence with his followers and active participation in meetings of the Secret Committee. The committee operated until 1927, addressing concerns about the transmission of psychoanalytic theory and training of psychoanalysts. The issue of accepting non-medical professionals for psychoanalytic training stirred significant debate, a point Freud expressed support for in his 1926 work, The Question of Lay Analysis. The American societies vehemently opposed this, citing concern for professional standards and potential litigation risks eventually. An agreement to allow societies autonomy in setting admission criteria was reached. Despite the challenges, Freud was awarded the Goethe Prize in 1930 for his significant contributions to psychology and German literary culture. Furthermore, Freud drew from his experiences with a number of patients, often using pseudonyms to protect their identities in his published case history. In his personal life, Freud battled health issues. In 1923, he diagnosed a benign growth, leukoplakia, caused by excessive smoking. Although he initially kept his diagnosis a secret, he later sought medical advice, which minimized the seriousness of his condition despite instructions to quit smoking and to get the growth excised. Freud underwent a risky operation that led to further complications. The severity of his condition was finally recognized by Felix Deutsch, but the dire diagnosis was hidden from Freud, fearing it might lead him to suicidal thought. In the theme of the story that reveals Jones's efforts to secure the immigration of Freud and a group of émigrés to London, Jones set forth to London carrying immigration permits requirements list prepared by Freud. Utilizing his connection with Home Secretary Sir Samuel Hoare, Jones sped up the permit approval process for all 17 individuals, obtaining work permits as necessary. He also drew on his scientific connections, convincing Sir William Bragg, the president of the Royal Society, to urge the Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax to apply diplomatic pressure in Berlin and Vienna. On Freud's behalf, American diplomats also supported Freud, particularly ex-patient and American ambassador to France, William Bullitt, who informed us, President Roosevelt, about the escalating threats facing the Freud family, which led to regular monitoring of their home by the American consul general in Vienna, John Cooper Wiley. The move from Vienna started sporadically in April and May 1938, with Freud's extended family leaving first. However, the procedures for Freud's own departure were complicated, entangled in legal and costly discussions with the Nazi authorities who appointed a commissar, Dr. Anton Sauerwald, to manage Freud's asset. Sauerwald, who developed a sense of compassion for Freud, secretly safeguarded Freud's bank accounts and the IPA library. Although Sauerwald's actions reduced some financial strain, the IPA's debts and the cost of Freud's valuable antiquity collection posed significant expenses. Freud, inaccessibility to his accounts, received financial help from Princess Marie Bonaparte. One of Freud's wealthy French disciples, her financial assistance, enabled Sauerwald to issue the necessary departure permits for Freud and his family. They eventually left Vienna on the Orient Express on June 4, reaching London on June 6 after a brief stay with Marie Bonaparte in Paris. In the early part of 1939, Sauerwald, a Nazi Party official, made a secretive journey to London where he encountered Alexander Freud. After the war, in 1945, Sauerwald was put on trial and incarcerated by an Austrian court for his Nazi associations. However, he was spared prolonged punishment through the intervention of Anna Freud, who validated his efforts to protect their family during his tenure as a Nazi commissar. Anna's testimony helped facilitate his release in 1947. The Freud family found a new residence in Hampstead at 20 Maresfield Gardens in September 1938. This house, altered to suit their needs by Freud's son Ernst, was reminiscent of his Vienna consulting rooms, maintaining the same ambience and visual aesthetics there. Freud continued his practice until his health began to deteriorate, all the while working on his final books. By September 1939, Freud was experiencing intense pain due to inoperable jaw cancer, which had him contemplating his mortality. He relied on his doctor, Max Schur, whom he had made a pact with earlier regarding the end of his life. Despite Anna's initial reluctance, his life was ended with doses of morphine administered on September 21 and 22, resulting in his demise in the early hours of September 23. Some facts around these events remain disputed, suggesting that Dr. Josephine Strauss, Anna's colleague, may have given the fatal dose. 3 days following his passing, Freud's remains were incinerated at Golders Green Crematorium in North London, a service arranged by Harrods at his son Ernst's request. Subsequently, funeral speeches were delivered by Ernest Jones and the Austrian writer Stefan Zweig. Freud's ashes were placed in a preserved Greek bell crater, a gift from Marie Bonaparte, which he kept in his study for years. Upon the death of his wife Martha in 1951, her ashes were also placed in the urn. Freud was among the pioneering researchers in cerebral palsy, then termed cerebral paralysis. He authored multiple medical papers on the subject, demonstrating its existence prior to its recognition and study by other researchers of that era. He challenged William John Little, the original identifier of cerebral palsy, contending that birth complications were symptoms, not causes as Little suggested. Freud attributed his initial engagement with psychoanalysis to Joseph Breuer, whose treatment of Anna O's case paved the path to the discovery of the psychoanalytical method. In November 1880, Breuer diagnosed a 21-year-old woman's persistent cough and hallucinations as hysteria following the death of her father. Anna's condition worsened, although some of her symptoms eventually subsided spontaneously. Breuer achieved complete recovery by making her remember the events that triggered specific symptoms. Anna went through 3 short sanatorium stays with a diagnosis of hysteria, with somatic symptoms raising questions about the success and authenticity of Breuer's treatment. From some authors, Freud, however, was inspired by Breuer's methods, and in the early 1890s, he developed a treatment plan that included interpretation and reconstruction techniques. By the mid-1890s, most of Freud's patients were describing early sexual abuse during childhood. Freud initially believed these accounts and developed his seduction theory, but later came to see them as Oedipal fantasies, the product of inborn sexual and destructive drives. Freud's clinical methodology involved his pressure technique as well as symbolic interpretation and analytic inference to trace symptoms back towards memories of early childhood sexual abuse. Despite his patients confidently asserting their disbelief after the execution of sexual scenes, Freud reported a full endorsement of his theory. This only deepened his colleagues' doubts about the validity of the conclusions drawn from his leading procedures over time. Freud displayed variance on whether his seduction theory still aligned with his progressive discoveries. Initially, he didn't isolate reality's importance and fantasy's debasement from his work, a perspective which he later revised. He later disagreed with his peer Ferenci's assertion that reports of sexual exploitation from his patients were actual recollections rather than subconscious creations. Freud attempted to discourage Ferenci publicly, expressing his theory. A fable, Rapp asserts in her study titled, "I No Longer Believe." Did Freud abandon the seduction theory? That Freud began unraveling the influence of early childhood molestation experiences on the psyche, but then primarily deserted this approach. In his early medical research career, Freud advocated for cocaine use as both a stimulant and painkiller. He contended that it was a remedy for numerous mental and physical discomforts, publishing a paper titled On Coca in 1884, praising its benefits. Between 1883 and 1887, Freud wrote articles endorsing various medicinal purposes, such as using it as an antidepressant. He nearly gained recognition for unearthing its analgesic qualities, which he'd only briefly mentioned. Instead, his Vienna counterpart Karl Kohler received this honor in 1884 for explaining its usage in detailed eye surgeries. Freud even propagated cocaine as a cure for morphine addiction. He gave cocaine to his friend Ernst von Fleischl, Marxo, a morphine addict suffering from relentless nerve pain due to a post-autopsy infection. Freud incorrectly claimed that von Fleischl, Marxo, was free from his dependency, never admitting his mistake even when von Fleischl, Marxo, rapidly developed an extreme cocaine psychosis, relapsed onto morphine, and died a few years later from relentless pain. Cocaine's anesthetic use emerged as one of its few safe applications, as reports about its addiction potential began to circulate worldwide. Freud's medical reputation took a hit after this cocaine episode. He stopped advocating for the drug publicly, but used it himself intermittently for depression, migraine, and nasal inflammation until he quit its use in 1896. Freud's later work, as detailed in his 1915 paper Repression redefines the notion of suppression, distinguishing between innate repression due to a universal incest taboo and the repression developed throughout an individual's lifetime from personal experiences. Freud articulated the development of his theories on the unconscious mind in another 1915 paper, The Unconscious, identifying 3 perspectives: dynamic, economic, and topographical. The dynamic view delves into the constitution of the unconscious through repression and the censorship process that keeps unwanted anxiety, inducing thoughts at bay, drawing upon his early work on hysteria. The economic angle focuses on the pathings of repressed content, observing the intricate transformations of repressed sexual impulses in both psychopathologies and everyday cognition. E. Dream Speech Errors, explored thoroughly in his books the interpretation of dreams and the psychopathology of everyday life. The topographical view shifts emphasis towards systematic properties, inherent processes, and operational modes of the unconscious prevalent before entering consciousness. In this first topography, Freud presents a structural model of the psyche composed of three systems. The unconscious, system X, where primary processes governed by the pleasure principle reside. The preconscious system Cs, where unconscious thing. Presentations are processed into language, word presentations, readying them for consciousness. And conscious thought, system Keynes, governed by the reality principle. These perspectives are built upon in his later work, The Ego, the ED 1923, introducing a second topography featuring ID ego, and superego supplementing the first model rather than replacing it. The ID, a reservoir of primitive instincts, carries a mix of innate and repressed drives. From the economic point of view, this ID is a primary source of psychic energy. But from the dynamic perspective, it's in a constant struggle with the ego and superego, diversifications of the ID. In the therapeutic environment, Freud utilized the process of free association to delve into the manifest content of dreams, what the dreamer consciously recounts. This exploration aids in revealing the latent content of the dream, the repressed thoughts and desires, and the mechanisms that shape the dream. Freud's research led him to perceive dreams not merely as fulfillments of wishes, but as a unique form of thinking altogether, a process solely made possible by the dream work. Further, Freud outlines the path of psychosexual development, which commences with the polymorphously perverse sexuality of infancy. The instinctual sexual drives progress through the stages that focus on the oral, anal, and phallic areas. Although these stages eventually lead to a period of latency where sexual interest and activity diminishes, from around age 5 till puberty, a level of perverse and bisexual residue typically persists and is incorporated in adult sexual behaviors. Freud explains the manifestation of neurosis and perversion as a result of a fixation or regression to these developmental stages, while the formation of adult personality traits and cultural creativity are results of a sublimation of this residue. The Oedipus complex further informs this developmental trajectory, predicated on the child's renunciation of forbidden desires under the threat of castration, real or imagined. He believed that his theoretical model was universally applicable and found supporting evidence from ancient myths and contemporary ethnography, suggesting that totemism showcased a dramatized version of the tribal Oedipal conflict. Freud also proposed a tripartite division of the human psyche into the ID, ego, and superego, developed further in Beyond the Pleasure Principles, 1920, and the ego in the EAD, 1923. This model supplanted his previous topographical model of the human psyche: conscious, unconscious, preconscious. The ID is the unconscious part of the mind that operates on immediate pleasure and immediate pleasure gratification principle. The superego is the moralistic element of the psyche. The ego, usually the most directly observable in a person's actions, seeks a balance between the impractical hedonism of the ID and the unfeasible moralism of the superego. This balancing act sometimes necessitates employing defense mechanisms like denial, repression, rationalization, and displacement when the ego is overwhelmed or challenged by its tasks. This dynamic interplay is effectively depicted in the iceberg model, symbolizing how the ego, ID, and superego relate to conscious and unconscious thought. Freud theorized the existence of two contrasting forces at play in human psyche: the libido, or life drive, and the death drive, dubbed Eros and Thanatos respectively by his contemporaries. According to Freud, the libido is a form of mental energy that powers thought processes, structures, and representations of objects. In Beyond the Pleasure Principle, 1920, he posited the existence of the death drive, a principle suggesting that the psyche strives to release its energy, aiming to reach a minimal tension level, a reinterpretation of a principle he'd previously abandoned. Freud highlighted the compulsion to repeat as evidence of the mind's attempt to release tension, which in extreme cases leads to a psychic death. This push to return to a state of maximum entropy was reflected in traumatic dreams and children's play. Here, Freud outlined two trends: one striving to master and attain pleasure from past experiences and another opposing it, which he termed Beyond the Pleasure Principle. He suggested that excessive repetition drained the mind's energy, leading to a return to less evolved psychic states, a theory some scholars refer to as metaphysical biology. Freud's 1917 essay Mourning and Melancholia differentiated between the normal grieving process, mourning, and the pathological refusal to let go of the lost one, melancholia. He proposed that during normal mourning, the ego enables the mourner's libido to detach from the person they lost for self-preservation, a process that's hindered in melancholia by unresolved feelings towards the lost one. The mourner's own ego can become the target of unconscious conflict in severe cases, potentially leading to suicide. Freud argued that women's sexual sensitivity transitions from the clitoral to the vaginal phase, tethering femininity with penis envy and emotional turmoil, thus leading to women's greater predisposition towards neurosis and hysteria. This development pathway for femininity, he argued, is subject to disruptions due to remnants of their early masculine period, which he believed possibly contributes to men's mystification of women. Karen Horney from the Berlin Psychoanalytic Institute refuted Freud's portrayal of femininity, contending instead for inherent femininity and reacting against the notion of penis envy. Horney enjoyed support from prominent figures like Melanie Klein and Ernest Jones, who coined phallocentrism, critiquing Freud's theory. However, feminist scholar Jacqueline Rose defended Freud's theories, suggesting that critics were assuming a more conventional take on female sexual development than Freud proposed. He also, despite his critics, insisted on clearly distinguishing between psychic and biological elements. Freud's vision of God was of an illusion stemming from an infant-like emotional need for a supreme, otherworldly father figure. He believed that religion once helped curb our primal nature in the early civilizational period, but in the modern era, it can be replaced by rational thinking and scientific understanding. Freud noted similarities between religious faith and neurotic obsession, and even suggested a scenario where society and religion emerged from the slaying and consumption of a powerful paternal figure who was held in collective veneration posthumously. In his view, the idea of a divine protector helps humans cope with their fear of nature, just as belief in life after death helps them deal with the fear of mortality. The story focuses on the theme of Freud's perception of religion as an intermediary that mitigates social and personal conflicts between Eros and Thanatos, the forces of life and death. Freud displayed a rather bleak outlook regarding civilization's future, as seen in his later works and further underlined in the 1931 edition of Civilization and Its Discontents. Humphrey Skelton encapsulated Freud's perspective as stoical humanism. Freud's conceptualizations of religious origins and its soothing illusions greatly contributed to the scientific humanist thoughts tradition, underscoring the powerful sway of childhood experiences on adult life, particularly in the sphere of religion. Moreover, in his 1909 work Analysis of a Phobia in a 5-year-old Boy, Freud proposed an intriguing theory to explain the universal fear of castration among uncircumcised males. Freud's legacy, albeit contentious, is widely esteemed as one of the most potent influences on 20th century thought, rivaling Darwinism and Marxism's impacts. His influence's breadth extends to virtually all cultural aspects, transforming our lifestyles and our understanding of human nature. Despite not being the first, Freud's psychoanalytic system revolutionized the realm of individual verbal psychotherapy from the early 20th century, laying the groundwork for numerous subsequent variations. Psychoanalysis has maintained significant sway in several modern psychotherapy schools, leading to innovative therapeutic interventions in schools, with families, and among groups, despite its declining influence in Europe and the USA. However, in other parts of the world, such as Latin America, its influence increased remarkably during the late 20th century. Among the Neo-Freudians, figures such as Alfred Adler, Otto Rank, Karen Horney, Harry Stack Sullivan, and Erich Fromm deviated from Freud's instinctual drive theory, instead prioritizing interpersonal relations and assertiveness. Adler initiated this approach, whilst his influence was indirect due to his theory's lack of systematic formulation. This new-style Freudian analysis shifted the focus to the patient-analyst relationship and decreased emphasis on exploring the unconscious. Finally, Carl Jung posited that the collective unconscious, symbolic of the cosmic order and human species history, is the most significant component of the mind. According to Lacan, the critical aspects of Freud's work completed before 1905 involved his revolutionary interpretation of dreams, neurotic symptoms, and slips. based on a new understanding of language, its connection to experience, and perception of self. Lacan argued that eco-psychology and object relations theory misinterpreted Freud's work. Lacan saw language as the key determinant of human experience, rather than the concept of self or relationships with others. Lacan also placed greater emphasis on desire than need, viewing it as inherently unfulfillable. In contrast, Wilhelm Reich evolved Freud's original concepts. These early concepts, later superseded but not entirely discarded by Freud, included the actual neurosis concept and a libido-based anxiety theory. The emphasis here was on real-life experiences, especially sexual ones, determining an individual's neurotic tendencies. Reich diverged from Freud by maintaining the significance of actual experience. By the 1920s, Reich expanded Freud's ideas about sexual release, defining orgasm as an indicator of healthy functioning. He evolved his character concepts into what later became muscular armor and finally a transmitter of universal biological energy, the orgone. Fritz Perls, a significant proponent of Gestalt therapy, drew influences from Reich, Jung, and Freud. A central tenet of Gestalt therapy is Freud's neglect of the structure of awareness, depicted as an active method leading to the formation of coherent wholes, gestalts between an organism and its environment. These gestalts are comprehensive patterns incorporating thought, feeling, and activity. Neurosis is perceived as a split in the creation of gestalts and anxiety as an organism's journey towards its creative unification. Therapy in this approach seeks to heal patients by bringing them in alignment with their immediate organismic needs. Unlike traditional psychoanalysis, speaking in Gestalt therapy is considered an act of self-expression, not a means to gain self-insight. This therapy often takes place in group settings, over concentrated workshops, and has evolved into novel forms of communal living. Frederick Crews holds Ellen Bass and Laura Davis, authors of The Courage to Heal, 1988, in high regard as advocators of survivorship, and identifies Freud as a key influence on their work. Yet to Crews, their debts are due to Freud's early pre-psychoanalytic theories, which emphasize the correlation between early trauma and its repressed memories that can be released for healing. He views this as a groundwork for recovered memory movements. However, their endorsement of Freud's insistence on accurate recall of early memories aligns them with current recovered memory therapists like Lenore Terr, which Crews sees as problematic because it has led to inaccurate imprisonments and unnecessary legal disputes. Freud's theories have indeed triggered prolific studies, with efforts to validate them through empirical research gaining momentum since the 1930s. When Saul Rosenzweig presented his experimental studies to Freud, Freud dismissed them, asserting that psychoanalytic principles were founded on reliable observations that did not require scientific verification. However, in 1977, Seymour Fisher and Roger P. Greenberg concluded that evidence did substantiate some of Freud's theories, in particular his descriptions of oral and anal personality traits, and his views on the concerns about love loss in women. Despite this, there were others that didn't align with contemporary research. In 1996, though, they noted a significant amount of experimental data in line with Freud's core theories. But not everyone agrees, with Hans Eysenck stating in 1985 that Freud held back the psychology and psychiatry fields, and Malcolm Macmillan asserting in 1991 that Freud's method lacks the ability to provide objective mental health data. Furthermore, Richard Webster contends in 1995 that psychoanalysis is a successful pseudoscience, and Crews concludes that it has no scientific or therapeutic value. Alan Hobson suggests that Freud, due to his dismissive rhetoric towards dream investigators like Alfred Maury and the Marquis de Hervé de Saint-Denis, in a time when the study of brain physiology was just emerging, impeded progress of scientific dream theory for decades. G. William Domhoff, a dream researcher, has disagreed with the alleged evidence of Freudian dream theory. Renowned philosopher Karl Popper argued that for any scientific theory to be valid, it should be falsifiable, which he claims Freud's psychoanalytic theories are not, implying they could never be disproved by any experiment. In contrast, philosopher Adolf Grunbaum argues in The Foundations of Psychoanalysis, 1984, that Popper was incorrect and many of Freud's theories can indeed be empirically tested, a viewpoint supported by others including Eysenck. However, another philosopher, Roger Scruton, writing in Sexual Desire, 1986, also challenged Popper's arguments, pointing out that Freud's repression theory does have testable implications. Despite this, Scruton concluded that psychoanalysis is not genuinely scientific since it relies excessively on metaphor. Philosopher Donald Levy sides with Grunbaum that Freud's theories can be falsified, but contests Grunbaum's claim that the therapeutic success of the theories is their only empirical evidence, suggesting that considering clinical case materials could contribute to a broader range of empirical evidence. In an examination of psychoanalysis in the U.S., Nathan Hale noted a decline of the practice in psychiatry from 1965-1985. Alan Stone observed a continuation of this trend, noting as academic psychology becomes more scientific than psychiatry, more biological, psychoanalysis is being brushed aside. Despite the declining interest in psychoanalytic training among psychiatric residents and the rise of psychiatric chairpersons with non-analytic backgrounds, noted by Paul Stefanski, Freud was still ranked as the third most cited psychologist of the 20th century in a 2002 review published in the Review of General Psychology. The publication also discussed a shift away from traditional psychoanalysis, leading to a revived interest in the field from various disciplines, including the humanities, neuroscience, and non-analytic therapies. Interpretations of psychoanalysis have ranged from the revolutionary to the conservative. By the 1940s, Freud's work was largely viewed by the European and American intellectual communities as conservative. This perspective was shared by critics both politically left and right of the psychoanalytic movement. Fromm, in his work The Fear of Freedom, 1942, argued that certain elements of psychoanalytic theory served political reaction, a notion echoed by writers sympathizing with the right. He portrayed Freud as an encourager of making the most of an unavoidably dismal fate in Freud, The Mind of the Moralist, 1959. But others, such as Herbert Marcus in the 1950s, rebelled against this prevailing conservative interpretation of Freud's work in Eros and Civilization, 1955. This sentiment was resonated by Lionel Trilling and Norman Brown. Marcus was critical of neo-Freudian revisionism, arguing the seemingly pessimistic theories could be channeled in a more utopian direction, and in doing so, Freud's ideas impacted the Frankfurt School and critical theory as a whole. There were those who compared Freud with Marx, stating that Freud has had as much of an impact on the field of psychiatry as Marx did on economics. According to Fromm, Freud, Marx, and Einstein are architects of the modern age. Although he saw distinctions in their impact, Deleuze and Guattari believed Freud's psychoanalysis was corrupted early on, specifically with his development of the Oedipus complex theory. Existential psychoanalysis emerged in attempts to merge Freud's theories with an existential account of human life, particularly in Sartre's Being and Nothingness, 1943, whereas Maurice Merleau-Ponty saw Freud as a precursor to phenomenology. Jacques Derrida viewed Sigmund Freud as both the culmination of Western metaphysics and, along with Nietzsche and Heidegger, a forerunner of his own profound radicalism. Many scholars aligned Freud's theories with Plato's, as both shared similar views of dream theory and the tripartite human psyche. However, Ernst Gellner holds the view that Freud's ideas offer a counterpoint to Plato's thesis, inverting its traditional hierarchy. Both Freud and Plato drew comparisons between societal and psychological structures, with Plato fostering the superego linked with the upper class, and Freud nurturing the ego associated with the middle class. Freudian psychoanalysis is also likened to Thomism by Paul Vitz, pointing out Stu Thomas's belief in an unconscious consciousness and frequent use of the word libido. Vitz speculates that Freud might not have realized the connection between his theory of the unconscious and that of Aquinas. W. H. Auden, the British poet, noted Freud's influence in shaping public opinion in his poem In Memory of Sigmund Freud. Literary critic Harold Bloom and author Camille Paglia also acknowledged Freud's influence, though Paglia refutes the scientific validity of his theories. With the advent of feminism, Freud's reputation began to wane. He was criticized by Simone de Beauvoir in her book The Second Sex and Betty Friedan in The Feminine Mystique for his perceived patriarchal views. His concept of penis envy was challenged by Kate Millett, while feminist Anne Coet suggested Freud's theories on female sexuality were influenced by his personal prejudices about women. Mitchell's work has been a crucial portal for English, Speaking Feminist, and Lacan, though her handling of Lacanian theory has been questioned by critics such as Jane Gallup. Feminists like French intellectuals Julia Kristeva and Luc Iraguirre have been inspired by Freud through Lacan's lens. A daring critique of Freud and Lacan's theories was put forth by Iraguirre, which she uses to reveal a psychoanalytic justification for theoretical prejudices or rigor content. That the cultural unconscious is skewed towards the male gender, which distorts the understanding of women's psychology. Noted psychologist Carol Gilligan mentions that the inclination of developmental theorists to brandish a masculine image is not a new phenomenon and cites the works of Jean Piaget and Lawrence Kohlberg as examples. Gilligan appreciates Nancy Choteau's effort to deconstruct sexual difference and attributes it to diverse early social environments of male and female children. Choteau challenges Freud's male-centric approach to psychoanalysis with a more balanced perspective. Juxtaposing Freud's analysis of religion with gender politics, Judith Van Herrick observes that Freud attributes weakness to femininity and Christianity, while reserving nobility and sacrifice for masculinity and Judaism. Total Moi, furthering feminist discourse and psychoanalysis, suggests the psychic impact of dealing with sexual difference, the presence of others, and the inevitability of death. She introduces Stanley Cavell's concept of victimization as a fitting replacement for Freud's castration, as a more universal term that accurately reflects the separate mortal existence of both genders. Freud's influence extends into popular culture, with his life depicted in films and TV series starting with the 1962 film Freud. The Secret Passion, the biographical miniseries by BBC titled Freud, The Life of a Dream, and the play and film duo The Talking Cure and a Dangerous Method, written by Christopher Hampton, focusing on Freud's intellectual conflict with Carl Jung, further explore Freud and contribution to psychology. The 2009 play, Freud's Last Session, penned by Mark St. Germain, is an imaginative piece picturing the discussion between C.S. Lewis at 40 and Freud at 83. The supposed event unfolds within Freud's Hampstead, London abode in 1939, right at the cusp of the Second World War. The dialogue predominantly revolves around the role of religion, examining whether it could be perceived as a neurotic symptom. Although the meeting never occurred, the play is construed from the 2003 nonfiction book, The Question of God. C.S. Lewis and Sigmund Freud debate God, love, sex, and the meaning of life by Arma Nicola. Beyond this serious charade, Freud is depicted in a comical light, portrayed by Alec Guinness as Freud's spectral self in the 1983 film Lovesick. Notably, a brief yet curiously compelling thread from the 1989 film Bill Ted's excellent adventure features Rod Loomis portraying Freud, one among the many historical figures who aid the film's leads in conquering their high school history presentation. Freud's prolific case studies, analysis, and interpretation of various matters pertaining to psychology, sexuality, paranoia have been published in various volumes, which include Tillman and Taboo, Thomas Woodrow Wilson, A Psychological Study, Fragment of an Analysis of a Case of Hysteria, The Dora Case History, and many others. These were later collated into the standard edition of the Complete Psychological Works of Sigmund Freud, translated under the editorship of James Strachey with Anna Freud, Alex Strachey, Alan Tyson, and Angela Richards, issued in 24 volumes by Hogarth Press and the Institute of Psychoanalysis between 1953 and 1974, representing a comprehensive insight into Freud's views and studies over the years. This paragraph comprises a list of extensive works, letters, and correspondence of Sigmund Freud, some of the profound contributors to the field of psychoanalysis. The publications encompass volumes on introductory lectures on psychoanalysis, outlines of the same subject, and discussions on Moses and monotheism. Other significant literal exchanges include letters between Freud with various personalities such as Martha Bernays, Otto Rank, Wilhelm Fless, Carl Gustav Jung, and Carl Abraham, revealing their association in the domain of psychoanalysis. Freud's correspondence with Ernest Jones and Ludwig Binswanger have also been documented. The 3 volumes of correspondence between Freud and Sandor Ferenczi highlight their exploration and discussions in the field of psychoanalysis over the years 1908 to 1930. 3 more compilations include Freud's letters to Edward Silberstein and his exchange of views about faith and psychoanalysis with Oscar Pfister. Compilations of Freud's letters with Lou Andreas, Salome, and Arnold Zweig, as well as the discussion between Einstein and Freud, captured in the book Why War? Contributes additional insight on his ideas. Lastly, a selected collection of Freud's letters, edited by Ernst L. Freud, offer a comprehensive perspective on the psychologist's thoughts and theories.